Welcome, welcome to the latest episode of Sovereign Submission Podcast. Today I'm going to talk about what happens when men say no to sex. And this is prompted in part by an article from Renata Alera in regards to how society treats male sexuality. And reading this article was a really good article. It kind of was affirming for me. And I think that this is a topic that a lot of men, I think pretty much every man has some kind of struggle around, because the reality is that there's this explicit expectation that men are supposed to always want sex and supposed to always crave sex and supposed to always be on and ready to have sex. And it creates a very interesting bind of a situation for men. Because if a man's supposed to always want to have sex, then it becomes a case where, like, if he doesn't want to have sex, it's viewed almost as if, like, well, what's wrong with him? Welcome, Glenn. Welcome, Dave. Glad to have you here. Feel free to comment or ask questions as I continue on this particular journey. And don't get me wrong, sometimes if a man has like a really low sex drive, there could be something going on. There could be, you could have low testosterone. There could be some health issues happening. And I think it's important to really be aware of those things. One of the things that I always advocate for is like doing a regular check on yourself, for example, touching your balls and like really checking for like testicular issues or anything like that, because that can be something to pay attention to. And just being more aware of your body in general, because a lot of men aren't very aware of their body. In fact, it's one of the reasons why I think there's so much emphasis put on men saying yes to sex, because a lot of times that seems to be the only way men get into their body. That and going to the gym and lifting weights. And the reality of the matter is that men don't always want to have sex. I say this as a man who I'm 49 years old and I have a fairly healthy libido. I definitely have sexual desires at any given moment of the day. I can feel that, but I don't necessarily always want to have sex. And the story here for me that I want to share with all of you is that I was in my second marriage, was one where a lot of times I would end up having sex because my ex-wife basically wanted to have sex, but I didn't. And if I didn't want to have sex, it would turn into a lot of her basically saying, I'm not enough. You aren't satisfied with me. You don't want me. And so I would end up having sex with her a lot of times just because I didn't want to hear it. I wouldn't necessarily be in the mood, but I'd be like, okay, she's horny and I've got to do something about this. And it felt really frustrating. It created a lot of resentment because it didn't feel like I had space to say no. And these are the kind of stories that we don't really hear about a lot of times. And I think that in and of itself is a really important thing to bring forward more. That, it is possible for a man not to feel in the mood, not to want to have sex. And I also understand why we don't really hear these stories. There's a number of different reasons that we can unpack here. Welcome, Maya. Glad to have you here. I mean, on the one hand, we have the story of male virality, right? Men are supposed to be virile. They're supposed to be sexual. They're supposed to always be on and ready to go. And if a man doesn't get hard and isn't ready to go, it's somehow viewed as problematic. It's viewed as, well, he's not man enough. I can't tell you how many times I've wrestled with that particular issue. at times where it's been like, oh my gosh, like, I'm not feeling it right now. I'm not necessarily in the mood. I don't want to necessarily have sex. And I feel this pressure because somehow I've got to live up to this societal and potentially relational expectation that I'm going to be ready to go. And it's only been in the last few years that I've really begun to unpack that enough where like I can sometimes be like, you know what, like down there, it ain't happening. That doesn't mean I can't be sexual with you, but the way I'm going to be sexual with you might be with toys or it might be with something else. And I can still have a really good time doing that and not feel like it lessens me as a man. And yet I think a lot of the time, what I observe around this particular phenomenon too is that there's so much pressure that is oriented around a man's cock and whether or not the man is going to be able to perform. Certainly, a lot of it is men putting that emphasis on themselves and putting that pressure on themselves. Sometimes I also think it can be pressure that is brought on by the expectation on the part of the person that he's with. And it's interesting because as a result, there's kind of this deeply hidden and embedded shame within within masculine psychology around performance and sexual identity that isn't really brought out or explored all that much, even in men's work. Welcome, Scott. Glad to have you here. Again, folks, if you have any questions or comments as I'm going through this, feel free to drop those in. I love it when people interact. It makes it much more interesting and fun. So I'm in the men's workspace and you might wonder, well, what do you mean by men's work? So like I've gone through Mankind Project, I've gone through Uncivilized, I've gone through some of the different programs and things like that. And of course I have my own offerings around that. And but one of the things I find really curious is that for the most part, when it comes to like sexual shadow, this is like one of the untapped areas. There are a few people out there who are doing work around sexual shadow. I've been venturing into it more, especially both in relationship to the whole sovereign submission aspect and exploring like what does it mean to be a submissive man and like what is the sexual dynamic there for a submissive man? Like what does that look like? And what are the sexual shadows there for him? But also looking at it in regards to porn. In fact, if you read my article earlier this week, I ended up talking a little bit about my own relationship with porn and how that pointed me toward my own sexual wounding and my own sexual shadows. Um, but I think in general, like we don't really look at the sexual shame that is in that is basically wrapped up in the expectation that you're gonna be able to perform. And it doesn't help that in a very real sense, we see, what I see out there, like for a lot of younger men, especially, is there's also these really, frankly, bizarre beliefs, I'll admit, around sexuality. Like, what I'll see like with the incel movement, like where it's like, okay, there's the Chads, the guys that are wealthy and can get any woman they want. And they're the ones who are keeping all the women for themselves and everything else. Like I'm like, what? WTF, I've never heard of that before this, but I get it. Like in some ways it's interesting to see because there's also kind of like this interesting shadow projection on that. What I think is really important for men to be able to do is to be able to claim their sacred no and their sacred yes. One of the things that became really important for me is that when I looked back at that marriage that I had been in, was recognizing all the times that I said yes from a place of nice guy energy. Like I was saying yes to having sex with somebody when I didn't always want to have sex with them because I wanted to avoid having the hard conversation around her trauma and her issues around not feeling like she was enough. And so I was like, all right, I'll have sex with you just so you can feel like you're enough and I don't have to deal with it then. Was that a mature way of handling it? No. It was what I did though. Part of it was also the feeling of, well, I have to perform. I have to live up to this expectation that I'm going to be ready, that if she shows interest, I have to be on and ready to go. And I didn't know at the time that, like, one of the things that I could possibly say is, like, no, this isn't really what I want to go for at this moment. Now, I'll admit, as someone who has fairly strong submissive tendencies, one of the things I do get off on and enjoy exploring is the idea of being sexually used by a woman. So there's also that interesting component because because then there's that part of me that's like, well, did I go? Was part of me, like, again, operating from a place of unconscious shadow, kind of going along with this because, hey, that was a convenient way for me to say, like, okay, I can act on this desire. I don't know if that was the case or not. And I mean, I've been out of that marriage for a few years now, but it was an interesting thing. Now, let me also flip the script here for you guys because the other interesting situation for me was being in a relationship that was pretty much sexless, and that was a couple of years ago where I was terminally sexually frustrated. I was with somebody who did not want to have sex with me. We had an open relationship, but the experience of being with this person, and we weren't even together for very long before it was like, nope, I don't want to have sex, was one, again, kind of got me to explore my nice guy tendencies in detail. But also it was interesting because it was like, okay, yes, on the one hand I could date other people, and on the other hand I didn't feel like I had the confidence for it because it was just like, well, like, I'm clearly there's something going on here. Really what was going on is that, there was just fundamentally I just came to an understanding, like, why am I letting myself get walked all over? This isn't worth it. And I walked out of that relationship because I knew that for me at least there was a sexual component that I wanted. Now, again, I know that for a lot of submissive men, there's some men who really get off on the idea of chastity, like not being able to, like, being put into a position where they're not allowed to have sex, where she's not gonna, or she's only gonna occasionally allow them to have sex, or and it's always gonna be about her pleasure and her enjoyment. That doesn't really work for me. And so it was really important for me to explore that. Like, so it kind of gave me an opportunity to also really explore, well, what happens when I'm in a relationship dynamic where there isn't sex happening and I'm the one who wants the sex. It gave me an interesting perspective too on my ex-wife, because then it was like, oh, well, now I kind of understand some of the frustration she must have felt at times if I wasn't interested. The main difference being, though, that the person I was with didn't have sex with me out of obligation or anything like that, whereas I had. So again, just kind of an interesting thing aside there. Welcome, Sheena. Glad to have you here. I share all this too because, like, on the one hand, like, talking about this stuff openly at all is kind of a weird, interesting place to be. Like, okay, here I am pulling back and showing you something about myself, and at the same time commenting on kind of the sexual dynamics and realities of life here and the things that are explored. But a part of it is also because, again, I think these are the kinds of conversations that aren't really explored or had. The other night I was in my local men's circle that I go to, and we were talking. We have a round that we do where we call telling on ourselves, and the telling on ourselves round is kind of like you basically tell, like, okay, here's an area of my life where I don't feel like I'm fully in alignment with myself or with my agreements or things like that. We do this every time. And it's always an interesting space to be in, because the idea of telling on yourself and revealing yourself to someone else is very much an act of opening yourself up and exposing yourself to potential judgments of other people. Now, I feel like in that particular space, I'm it's very much a quote unquote safe space. And one of the things that's really good about that space is that it's helped me to learn how to have the conversations in other spaces where it doesn't necessarily feel as safe. to have those conversations. And that's one of the reasons I think that this kind of conversation is important, because if men don't have the permission to explore like how to bring up stuff that brings them into a place where it's like, I'm being really vulnerable here. And like, for example, I'm not feeling very sexual and I don't necessarily want to have penetrative sex, or I don't want to do this thing or that thing. Well, okay, can that man actually feel supported in that, and to know that he's not going to be judged and castigated for not wanting to have sex? Can the man even say no? I'm going to bet you dollars to donuts that most of the time, most men are not going to feel like they can say no, because they're going to feel like if they say no, there's going to be a few different things that come up. One, if I say no, then I'm missing out on the chance to have sex, and if she's not in the mood at another time that I want to have sex, then I've just missed out. So I'd better be ready. That is one of the mentalities that occurs. And I think that there's, again, things to unpack there that are, but we're just going to talk about the mentality here for the moment. But then there's also the other reality of it, which I think is just as important, which is where a lot of times men will say, yeah, I'm ready to go, or I'm gonna make myself ready to go, because it's like, if I don't make myself ready to go, then I'm sharing a vulnerable part of myself, perhaps, or I am basically exposing myself, and that's where all the shame comes out around my masculinity and my identity as a man. I've certainly had that happen before, where I haven't felt sexual, and it's ended up being a thing, and this isn't a reflection on the person that I was with at the time. This has been more a reflection on me, where it's like, what's ended up happening is it's been the perfect storm, so to speak, where all the issues around my own relationship with my masculinity come boiling to the surface. And a large part of it really is that men's sexual ability is directly tied to their identity. Let that land with you for a moment. Let that really land with you, and think about that for a moment. And, I have a few men here who are in this audience. I have a few women. So for the men in this audience, I want you to just really think about this for a moment. Like, how is my sexual identity, my sexual ability tied to my identity as a man? Like, how does that land with you? And for that matter, for the women, I'm going to ask the same thing. Like, how does your sexual identity tied to your experience of the feminine in your body and in yourself? Because I don't think that this is just like one or the other. I'm speaking to my experience as a man here, but I think this is a question that's worth unpacking and exploring more in relationship to who we are, what we are, and how we interact with each other, and the societal expectations and pressures and all the other fun stuff that comes with exploring these topics. Now, in the article that I'm gonna put a link in the show notes afterwards. This article from Renata, you know, and one of the things she says is that we have a hard time imagining a man saying, "I'm not in the mood, I'm too tired, or I'm still thinking about work, or I'm sorry, I'm just not attracted to you." And this idea that men are unfeeling sex machines. I mean, I can safely say that this is not the case. A lot of times when I have not felt sexually active, it's because there's been an emotional component at work. One of the things that happened, and this was really fascinating for me, was that in my own sexual history and experience, I could last for a long time sexually. Like when I had sex with somebody, like I could, stay hard for a while and everything else. But then I found that the more I did the work to dissolve like the ice in my heart, to soften the walls and to bring things down, the more that I actually discovered that my relationship with my body changed. and that sexually I changed in some ways. I started to not be able to hold back as much or for as long. And I've had to kind of renegotiate that and explore that and be like, well, why is that? And part of it is, well, I'm feeling a lot more. I'm feeling a lot more emotionally. And so as I'm feeling more emotionally, my body is loosening up in some ways. And the things that I've done to control have actually loosened up as well. And so then it's like, well, I get to explore that as well and what that means for myself as a man. And does this make me less of a man because I feel more and suddenly I'm not my relationship with my sexuality has changed, or does it make me more of a man, or does that even matter? Dave has a question here. Is there a way you found to limit or free the relationship from the societal conditioning? What are some of the difficulties of this? Oh, great question, Dave. And thank you for asking. Here's what I found that I think is true. The way to free the relationship from societal conditioning is to be able to have conversations around sex. Conversations where both of you or more of you, if you're in a relationship with more than one person, can actually have honest and real conversations with each other. Hard conversations is what we might even call them. Like being able to say, okay, like saying to your wife or girlfriend or however you choose to label the person you're with, um, like, hey, how, if I were to say no, how would you feel about that? Can we talk about that and unpack it? Now, here's the thing, like, that's going to be a theoretical conversation in the moment. But even exploring it in theory can be a really useful way to understand like what happens when then, that person comes to you and they're really in the mood and you're like, you know what, like I'm not. I'm really tired or I'm really stressed or I have something going on right now. Or the other aspect of it too is being able to just be really real about the respective pressures. And And this means, like, for men, being able to listen to women share kind of like, well, here's the pressures I feel around sex. Because there are definitely pressures that women feel around sex. Some of them we might think we know. And I think there's a lot that we really don't know. And it's really important to be real about that and be curious about it. Like being able to say, like being able to really connect with curiosity to what the woman's experience is sexually and being able to hear her experience and what that means and like the pressures and challenges that she may be feeling and then being able to share our own as well. And I'm not going to promise you that these conversations are going to be easy. They're not easy conversations to have. And the reason they're not easy is because of the societal conditioning, but the only way we can deprogram that societal conditioning is to actually have them. Trying to do it on our own is only going to work to a limited degree. I think it is really important for men to explore their own relationship with their sexuality. One of the suggestions that I have when I talk with my clients around, for example, their own sexual history and relationship is to look, for example, at like what is their relationship with porn. A lot of people say, well, like if I'm watching porn and everything else, like the answer is just to stop using it. Well, that's part of that may be part of the answer, and it more than likely is because in my personal opinion, I think porn has been developed to neuter people, in a very real sense. But I think that it's also like, well, what is the porn pointing at? For me, for example, when I looked at my own porn usage, and again, I wrote about this in the article, and I'll share a link to that as well in the show notes for this. But when I looked at it, it was like, oh, my porn usage is in part related to being rejected by my stepmom, not sexually, folks. Just want to be very clear here. But like, when I grew up, like, there was a point in time where all of a sudden she became really angry and took a lot of her anger out on me because of something that happened with another family member, well, two other family members, but one of those family members ended up leaving, but I was her stepson, and I was left behind, and she felt a lot of anger. And it and I ended up basically become went from being someone who was relatively loved and approved of to suddenly not being loved and approved of and wanted. And you wouldn't think that that would have a role on someone's sexuality, but it does. Our sexual imprints are created early on, and there are reasons that like our wounds, the areas of trauma that we have, come out sexually. So a lot of times our sexual desires, our kinks, our porn usage, all that other stuff can point to that. And let me be clear, at the same time, it doesn't not necessarily always mean that. I mean, and it could also be a case where like there is a wounding there, you heal that wounding and you still want certain things, and that's perfectly healthy and normal. So that's an important thing to consider as well. Dave said, "This makes perfect sense. I think an odd taboo is talking, communicating during these times. We seem to be conditioned to not talk about it. This is the mistake, I think." It's a huge part of the mistake. One of the things that I say in regards to the work that I do with clients is that I help my clients have the hard conversations that they're not having right now. What does that really mean? It means that a lot of times just even having a space to sit and talk with somebody about the hard conversation that needs to be had can start the ball rolling. And until you have that hard conversation with somebody, it doesn't necessarily even need to be with the person that you need to have it with, but it might need to start with somebody else. It's not going to happen until it does. And I can think of so many times in my life where I didn't have the hard conversations with people and how that ended up sabotaging, poisoning, and destroying the relationships because it created a lot of resentment and anger, and it created behaviors that came out sideways. And that's the thing that we have to really look at is like, what is the cost of not having these conversations? What is the cost in terms of who we are? This is one of the reasons why I like to help men have these conversations, because if we don't get real with each other and with ourselves, we're not going to be able to be real with the people that we're in relationship with. And this is also one of the reasons I'm a firm advocate for spaces where men can meet and talk and connect with each other, because a lot of times some of those conversations end up happening there. And then as a result, they end up happening in the areas of life where they really need to be happening. And again, they're not easy, but if we try to go it alone, a lot of times we will not have those conversations. So it's really important to recognize that, and also to just recognize that, like, coming back to the original topic here, this is what I really want to say is that if you're watching this, regardless of how you identify gender wise or sexually or anything else, like, you have the right and the sovereignty to say no. And it's important to really recognize and understand, like, what that just because somebody else wants something from you doesn't mean you have to say yes. I'm not going to really get into a topic here that I could today. I will get into it another time, which is around male rape. I've been raped, so I know what it's like. And this is, again, something most men will not talk about, but I think it's a really important topic to explore and talk about, because it's something that until we have these conversations around, we're not really able. We're going to continually have this very limited relationship with our own sexuality and what our sexuality is and what it means and what we say yes to and what we honor and how we claim our identities in a healthy, embodied way. Sheena said, part of separating sex from societal conditioning is getting curious in the moment. Straight up saying no without exploration can be alienating. Sex is often shorthand for connection, physical touch being acknowledged, and so much more. So it's easy to hear a no to sex and conflate it to rejection of the whole of the other instead of a very specific act. Yeah. That's absolutely right, and that's part of where these conversations are become so important. What would it look like, for example, if I were to say no to a specific action, but say, "But I'm open to doing X, Y, and Z." Oh, okay. That's a different thing as opposed to just saying, like, no altogether. There is context to be had here, and I think a lot of times what ends up happening is that the context isn't really explored. There's also the other reality, and this is a reality that I think is really important too, is that sometimes there is rejection there. And what does that mean? Not that rejection is an easy thing to handle, a lot of times it isn't. One of the things that I think has happened is a lot of times though we don't explore even our own relationship with rejection. I ended up spending a good period of time exploring that relationship myself with rejection because I was in a situation where, well, because of the situation I mentioned, and it was like, okay, I'm getting rejected every single day, and really it was that I ultimately came to the conclusion I'm really just being rejected overall. Like, this wasn't just a sexual rejection; there were other forms and signs of it. And it became something that really it was good for me though in one sense. I mean, it wasn't a good experience to go through, but it was good for me in one sense in that it really helped me to understand, well, how do I handle rejection and what ultimately do I do to walk away so I can honor myself and not continue to put myself in a situation where maybe somebody is using me and taking advantage of me. There's a lot of things, there's a lot to unpack here. But I'm gonna wrap this up and just say, first of all, thank you to all of you who came on here. I appreciate it. Appreciate you making the time to be here. Again, I want you to remember that you can honor your no. Like, honor your truth and honor your ability to say no. I'm not saying that it's easy. I would definitely say have conversations around this. And these aren't going to necessarily be easy conversations, but they are empowering conversations. And when we can have these conversations, then that's when we can start to really explore what it means to be in relationship with somebody, in relationship with ourselves as well. You have the right to say no. And you also have that's part of your sovereignty. And so that way when you do say yes, you can fully give that yes from a place of genuine genuine enjoyment, pleasure, and full beingness, which is, what I think all of us want. We want to fully be with each other. And yeah, having those conversations can provide some context. It may not just be a flat out no. It just might be a no with no, I don't want to do this. And yes, I could do these other things. There's a lot of things to explore there. And this conversation has only touched on the tip of the iceberg, as the case may be. But we'll explore more of this in later live sessions and other posts and things like that. And if you're a man who is watching this and you're like, hey, this is really resonating with me. One of the things that I do offer is I do offer a crucible session, which is a breakthrough, like 90-minute breakthrough coaching session. So if you have a particular issue that you want to talk about or explore, we can do that together. And the link will be in the show notes here. So thank you all so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.